They buried Justice last week in Texas. No one said a word. No preacher wept, no choir sang, just a boy lying cold in the ground and his killer walking free. In Texas, a 17-year-old boy named Austin Metcalf was stabbed to death at a high school track meet. His killer? Carmelo Anthony. He didn't even deny it. Witnesses said he pulled a knife after a petty argument and plunged it into Austin's chest. But instead of seeking justice, a judge slashed the killer's $1 million bond down to $250,000. Leftist activists raised over $400,000 for him and his family. The murderer walks free. The victim is 6 feet under. Meanwhile, in Milwaukee, another judge, Hannah Dugan, used her robe not to uphold justice but to smother it. She helped a twice-deported illegal immigrant, a man charged with domestic abuse, slip out the back door and escape ICE agents. And every day, in the homes of so-called Christian men, leadership is abandoned, not with a roar, but with a whisper. A wife's tears, a child's tantrum, a church's fear of offending. Little acts of surrender that pile up into a mountain of rebellion. This is not love, it's not mercy, it's not compassion, it's cowardice. This is the sin of empathy, a coward's virtue, a rebel's excuse. It's the soft corruption that lets wickedness thrive and righteousness rot. Today on the Patriarchy podcast, we tear off the funeral shroud and we call men to rise from the grave of passivity. God's justice is not dead, but it needs men who will fear him more than the trembling voices of man. And so this is a great conversation you don't want to miss out on. Join me then as we build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarchy.
Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser.
Rise up, O men of God, have done with lesser things. Give heart and mind, soul and strength, and serve the King of Kings. Lift high the cross of Christ, tread where his feet have trod. As brothers of the Son of Man, rise up, O men of God.
He who says to the wicked, "You are righteous," peoples will curse him, nations will abhor him. But to those who rebuke the wicked will be delight, and a good blessing will come upon them. That was Proverbs 24 through 25. I am Pastor Joseph Spurgeon, and you are listening to the Patriarchy Podcast, a ministry of Sovereign King Church. In Milwaukee, just recently, justice didn't just take a detour, it crashed into a ditch. Judge Hannah Dugan, a woman sworn to uphold the law, chose instead to spit on it. That is, when ICE agents came to detain a twice-deported illegal immigrant facing fresh domestic abuse charges, Judge Dugan didn't deliver justice. She delivered an escape plan. With a whispered warning and a side door left open, she helped a criminal slip through the fingers of the law she swore to defend. And she was arrested, and now everybody is in an uproar. Meanwhile, we see a culture that glorifies violence when it suits their narrative. A young white boy stabbed at a sporting event, ignored. The young black boy who committed murder made into a folk hero. Real victims are forgotten while criminals become martyrs. Empathy has been replaced with selfish political theater. But it's not just the judges and politicians selling out justice, it's actually happening in our homes, our churches too. How many men have handed over their leadership because they fear the tears of a wife more than the commands of Christ? How many fathers have refused to discipline their children because they felt too much empathy and not enough love for their souls? This sentimental weakness doesn't look like rebellion on the surface, but make no mistake, it is. When feelings rule the household, when the fear of upsetting someone replaces the fear of God, leadership dies, and with it, so does the strength of a people. When what we're witnessing isn't true compassion, it's not biblical love, it's a counterfeit, a cowardly, sentimental, empathy that fears man more than it fears God. It's a soft and effeminate corruption of justice and is killing our ability to lead with strength and righteousness. Today's guest, Dr. Joe Rigney, is no stranger to this battle. His recent book, The Sin of Empathy, has stirred up a firestorm by daring to say out loud what many have felt but few have had the courage to declare. That is, empathy, when separated from God's truth, God's law, it's not virtue, it's a vice. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Joe Rigney to the Patriarchy podcast.
Good to have you. Good to have me. Good to be on here. Thanks.
You're welcome. Well, Dr. Rigney, you've been blasted really all over the place since you put out this book for saying that empathy can be a sin. Since the mob came after you, would you like to take this moment to publicly renounce your position, or would you like to double down?
No, I'm going to go ahead and double down. I've been through the rodeo before, but no, the reaction's not all that surprising. Some of it actually, I feel conflicted because some people are legitimately confused, and then there are other people who I don't think are confused at all, but the confusion is convenient for them.
All right. Well, so let's talk about what actually, so you said the sin of empathy, and that, of course, that stirs up a lot. I mean, what are you saying? We're to be hard-hearted and not care about people. Do you make a distinction between sympathy and empathy? And does that matter?
Yeah. So the basic distinction that I want to make is sympathy is a Bible word. I'd like to hang on to it, but it's the sort of word that in certain places, at least, has actually kind of fallen on hard times because people regard it as a insufficient caring response. So there's a famous little video in which Brene Brown, a secular author, talks about how sympathy is insufficient when people are suffering and hurting. It kind of stands aloof and cold and doesn't really suffer with people. And instead, empathy is the more loving, sacred space kind of response. And so there's a linguistic thing happening there that I think is interesting. And I think the elevation of empathy over sympathy in, say, the last 30, 40 years is significant. And I don't want to lose the old Bible word. And I want to dive into why what is so much better about this newer virtue, because it is relatively recent. It's 100-year-old word. It's not that old. And so what is the shift? What does it represent? And at the same time, I don't want to wrangle about words. So there's some people who all they mean by empathy is to be kind to someone or to share some emotions at some level. But they could mean by empathy what I typically mean by compassion or sympathy. And I don't want to fight with them over a semantic difference. I'm interested in substantive differences, which I think are really there. And the basic one is that while sympathy and compassion, as they're laid out in the scriptures, is a virtue because it's an orientation to hurting people, to suffering people, that joins them in their suffering, but remains tethered to what is true and what is good. That's the basic idea of compassion, is you're moved with compassion to seek someone's ultimate good by relieving their distress and their pain, but you're not so fixated on the immediate pain that you get swept off your feet. Empathy, on the other hand, I think, in the way that it's used, the way that it's often practiced in the modern world, is a more total immersion in the suffering and pain of another, so that it does sweep you off your feet. So if someone's drowning in quicksand, sympathy stays on the side, tethered to the side, while you try to reach in and connect to them in order to help them get out. Empathy just jumps in, both feet, and now you got two people drowning. And both of those are contrasted with apathy, which I think is what people are often concerned about, which would be you don't even try to help them at all. You just stand on the side of the shore with your arms crossed. Or, so if you think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, the two guys that walk by on the other side of the road, that's apathy. We don't want that. I think what they offered to that guy was sympathy and compassion, but empathy would be a more total immersion that would lead you to do some really unwise, foolish, and ungodly things in the name of, quote unquote, helping them.
Yeah. When people hear about the sin of empathy, I kind of think of, there's this old funny church sign. It says, we love hurting people. Have you ever seen that church sign?
Right.
It's like, and I think that's how people, it kind of is the thing. Yeah. Okay. Is that what you're saying? We love hurting people?
Yes.
Or do we love people that are hurting? And I think people hear all that. And what you're trying to get at is more than just playing word games, but it's actually something much deeper. So where does this, then, so you said empathy is new. Where does that come from?
Yeah, it was originally a term that kind of came, it was a German word that came into English in the early 20th century in the realm of art. And it had to do with when you see a landscape or something and you try to project your emotions into it. That's kind of you feeling into it, suffering into it. And then it kind of migrated over in the 50s, 60s, 70s, kind of moved into the counseling world, the therapeutic world, and then kind of took root there, which is where it's lived for a long time. And I think actually part of the reaction to sin of empathy, even at some level, is just taking a word that is at home in a therapeutic context and then putting it right next to a word that's more at home in a more traditional moral framework. And you stick them next to each other and people just kind of feel like that doesn't fit. And at some level, that's also suggestive. That's also telling us something about our therapeutic frame, that the therapeutic frame that we live in doesn't often have room for words like sin. Because we have, so the therapeutic frame will talk in terms of brokenness, but then describe sin in terms of brokenness, which I think at one level is fine. It's when it becomes the only frame, it becomes the only way to talk about human corruption that it becomes a problem. And so if you want to talk about sin and brokenness, great. But if you only want to talk about one or the other, you're probably going to lean into this idea of untethered empathy that's removed from what is true, what is good, and what is helpful. And I think when people get real confused about this, what I want to say is, if you've ever been on the receiving end of a pity party, so someone in your family is throwing a pity party, and then as a result of that pity party, you've caved and given in on something that you knew wasn't a good idea, but you gave in anyway because they were putting on the long face. And as a result, worse things happened. That would be an example. Okay, that's the sin of empathy. You let their pain, suffering, the long face, and the pity party, you let that steer you into doing things that were unwise and unfaithful. And as a result, you get the consequences. And in that sense, empathy and whether you call it empathy, sympathy, compassion, pity, I don't care. Whatever word you use for it, like other passions, is good, but dangerous. It's the sort of thing that can jump the rails when we talk about someone who, I was blinded by my anger. And so that's the sin of anger. I was blinded by it and it got out of control and I lost control. Or I was overwhelmed by grief and said some things I didn't really mean. Or I was paralyzed by fear and therefore I didn't do what I was supposed to do in that moment. All of those are examples of passions overpowering our rational faculties and our will such that we don't do what we ought to do. And I'm wanting to say that pity or empathy or whatever you want to call it is the same kind of thing. It's the sort of thing that when it's untethered becomes destructive.
So do you have any biblical examples of this sin of empathy that you're talking about?
Yeah. So in the Old Testament, there's a number of places in like Deuteronomy, for example, where we're commanded, where God says, your eyes shall not pity. And so usually it's things like first-degree murder, or if someone falsely accuses someone of some crime, grave crime, but it's a false accusation, and then God says, whenever that's revealed, your eyes shall not pity them, but you shall do to them what they were trying to get done to the other guy. Or idolatry. So if your family member, and he piles up those affectional terms, the son of your mother, the son of your daughter who you love, the friend who's as your own soul, someone really, really close to you, who you have a lot of warm-hearted affection for. If they try to lead you to worship false gods, he says, your eyes shall not pity them, your hand shall be against them, and you shall put them to death. And so that would be a place where here's grave sin against God and against the people, where pity would be inappropriate. It would be a sin to show pity here, and therefore to let them off the hook would be to sin against God. So that in that case, empathy towards them, pity towards them would be a sin against God. So that's one example. I think the actual, like a concrete example of seeing something like this happen is Aaron at the golden calf, where the people are distressed, they're traumatized. And I think that would, in that circumstance, I think that word would actually fit. They've been slaves for a couple hundred years. They watched a civilization get destroyed at God's hands. They thought their kids were going to die if they didn't put, the blood. If they put the blood on, the kid lived. If they didn't, the kid died. They were harassed and chased through the wilderness. They came to the Red Sea. God miraculously parted. They'd been put through the ringer. And through it all, Moses has been God's representative, and now he's missing. He's up in the cloud somewhere. We don't know what happened to him. And they're distressed. They're scared. They're agitated. And so they come to Aaron and they say, give us gods. We need gods. We need somebody to make us feel safe. And Aaron finds their distress overwhelming, intolerable, and therefore does the unthinkable. He violates God's law and builds them a calf so that they can feel better. And so I think that'd be I think Aaron there is being a very empathetic leader who's allowing the emotions of the people to steer him and manipulate him rather than taking responsibility and caring for them the way God wants.
What is behind, you think, this sin of empathy? What what's usually there's a sin that's even deeper behind these other things. In fact, you can boil all sin down to idolatry and a lack of faith. But what are the kind of motives and things that are behind being so empathetic that you refuse God's commands and that stuff?
Yeah, so I think it's like so C.S. Lewis. I use him a lot in the book. He has the book The Four Loves, where he talks about the way that natural affection, that natural family affection or friendship or romantic love can go wrong. And the principle that he kind of uses that runs through all of it is that love ceases to be a demon when it ceases to be a god. Or he flips it around and he says love becomes a demon when it becomes a god. So any natural love, when it sets itself up as God, becomes demonic and destroys itself and the people who participate in it. And so he uses maternal love as a good example of this, where maternal love, of course, is a great gift from God. It's nurturing, it's caring, and so forth. But when God's hand isn't on the reins, what happens to mother love? And the answer is it becomes possessive, monomaniac. It becomes a vampire. It sucks the life out of the kids. It coddles them to death. And so that's Lewis's example of that kind of over-possessive kind of maternal love is a problem. And what I'm doing is basically saying, good, that's a great principle. Love becomes a demon when it becomes a god. And that applies just as well to something like love for the hurting, the broken, and the suffering, which is what compassion is. When God's hand isn't on that reins, it also becomes demonic. And you find yourself doing all sorts of really, really evil things in the name of compassion. So you think of the pity party example in a home where you get sort of steered, manipulated. You look out in the culture, you mentioned a couple, but you think of something like the way that the LGBT movement was able to gain so many of its victories, cultural victories. How did it do that? By constantly presenting first gays and lesbians, and then later trans and other sexual deviants in a very empathetic light. They're victims. They're victims. Life's hard. And therefore, we need to rearrange society in order to accommodate their desires. And we did. They were presented as victims, and we needed to be empathetic towards them by doing what they wanted. And so Obergefell, and then now you have to use the pronouns. We're gonna allow them into the girl. They really feel like he's a woman. That man really thinks he's a woman, and so we need to allow him to go into the girls' bathroom. Or that swimmer really wants to swim with the girls because he thinks he's a girl. We really got to let him do it and so all of society gets reoriented, because if you don't, their feelings are going to be hurt, or they're going to be harmed in some way psychologically. That rejection or that denial of who they really are is unthinkable. So that's a good example of the way that victimhood is kind of used to steer soft-hearted people. And I think for Christians, because we have commands from God that we are to be kind and tenderhearted, we're to be merciful and gracious like he is, because we're supposed to show compassion like Christ did, it can be a temptation. Because if someone can frame the conversation as here's a victim and here's what compassion means, then Christians go, well, I have a command to be compassionate to victims. And so we'll go along with it while thinking that we're doing what's right, when in actuality, we're being steered and manipulated to do what is evil.
And so it seems what you're saying is that this really boils down to a replacing God with man. And you can call it the fear of man. You can call it an undue love. But interestingly enough, it actually, we would call it love, but as you said, it becomes a demon. It actually switches from what real love is to hate. The example you gave of motherhood, I see this all the time when we go, our church frequently goes outside of the gay pride events and preaches, and we will see women, in their 60s or 50s, bringing their sons and their daughters into these events, celebrating it. And that growing up, that they had no desire to ever be celebrating this. This wasn't something when they were growing up, or even 10, 15 years ago, they would have thought of. But now, because of this, I think, idolatry of their children, in a sense, this undue, what they would call love, but I think it's just a misplaced desire to please them, has now led them to actually be leading their children into a place to celebrate things that are actually going to destroy their mind, their body, and their soul. So it actually, it masquerades as love, but it ends up with hate, because it will destroy them.
Right. Well, and again, you think about the way that doctors and the medical establishment manipulate parents when it comes to the trans issue. Would you rather have a dead son or a live daughter? Sort of holding the suicide of their child over their head like a sword, and says, if you don't affirm and celebrate this, and if you don't put them on puberty blockers, and if you don't castrate them or remove their breasts, then your child's going to die, and it will be your fault for not, because they will feel so rejected by you because you're insisting, no, you're a boy, you're not a girl.
One day, your son is going to look up at you and ask, Dad, what does it mean to be a man? What will you tell him? We live in a world that calls masculinity toxic, that treats boyhood like a disorder. But your son needs to know the truth, that God made him to be strong, to fight for what's right, to protect others, to build, to lead, to worship our King. That's why I wrote It's Good to Be a Boy, to give fathers a tool to teach their sons what it truly means to be a man. Dads, don't let the world define manhood for your son. Teach him, lead him, show him. It's Good to Be a Boy, available now on Amazon. Get your copy today.
Today, Junior?
If you keep calling them by the name that you gave them when they were born, if you keep calling him Johnny instead of saying, no, he's now Susie, you're so psychologically damaging them that they will commit suicide. And then what will you feel? And there's a way that actually kind of gets at some of, you asked what's underneath it. There is a way that some of what happens with the sin of empathy is a kind of self-centeredness in that regard, right? Like, I don't want to feel bad for the consequences. I don't want to feel bad because I made someone else feel bad. Because if I say what's true here, if I hold the line, then they're going to be upset with me, which is also, as you mentioned, kind of the fear of man thing. So when some people look at the Aaron at the golden calf, they say that's not empathy, that's cowardice. He was a coward. And I say, yeah, all these things are all related because it's emotions slide into one another. It's actually another element of this whole dynamic is people don't realize that if you encourage lots and lots of empathy, you're also probably encouraging lots and lots of anger, because compassion for victims entails hatred and anger towards their oppressors. So Lewis makes this point about pity. He says, pity, when it's untethered from, it's a good emotion, but when it's detached from justice and charity and love, the moral law, leads through a very natural process through anger to cruelty. Pity leads through anger to cruelty because the atrocities of the other side justify our own atrocities back. And pity for the oppressed classes leads through this process to a reign of terror, to brutalities that you couldn't have imagined. It's amazing how cruel you can be to people in the name of pity or empathy. And this is, modern researchers study this, and they were surprised because they thought, okay, we want more empathy in the world. We need more empathy. And so they would do these tests to try to figure out how to encourage it. And what they found is that the folks who self-described as most empathetic and who measured high on the quote unquote empathy scale also were the ones who were most tribal and polarized against their enemies. They couldn't imagine the perspective of the other. So they actually found that liberals, who tended to be more empathetic, really could not grasp the conservative frame of reference. Like, they just couldn't even understand it. Conservatives are just evil. Whereas conservatives, who tend to not be as empathetic culturally defined, were actually able to understand where liberals were coming from. So they actually, and so sometimes researchers will distinguish between cognitive empathy and affectional empathy. So affectional empathy would be sharing the emotions. Cognitive empathy would be understanding where someone's coming from. But it's a cognitive act, it's a rational act, and those aren't exactly the same. People can be really high in the one and not as high in the other. And so there was interesting kind of discoveries as they realized that actually empathy might be one of the things that's tearing us apart, because it feeds this tribalism. And when you step back and you go, biblically, how would I explain that? I say, well, passions are powerful, right? Passions are powerful. Feelings are really, really powerful things that need to be kept on a leash. And if you unleash them, if you take them off the leash, if you untether them from reality, they will sweep you off your feet. And then when you're encouraging everybody to share them, now you've just got one big bundle, one big blob of emotion that's just careening around. And sometimes it's really happy, and sometimes it's really compassionate, sometimes it's really angry, and sometimes it's really fearful. And it's just one big bundle of emotion. And if you're, as a leader, you've been taught, be empathetic, share that emotion, then your tendency is going to be to do what Aaron did, which is to buckle to the mob.
This actually seems to tie into your other book, The Emotional Sabotage.
Correct.
And leadership. How about we put some flesh on this then? Like, we've talked about it broadly culturally. I gave some cultural examples. How does this work itself out? Let's talk about the church, and then let's talk about the family life. So how does this work itself out in the church?
Yeah. So I think one of the ways, say over the last 10, 15 years, I think two things happened. One is that the virtue of compassion or empathy became left coded, meaning it was defined according to progressive standards. So it was the who are proper objects of empathy. Well, it's whatever progressivism defined as proper objects of empathy. Racial minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ, all of those women, typically in terms of like a feminist kind of mode, they were defined as these are the true objects of empathy, and therefore you need to show that you care well for those groups.
Yeah, there's not a lot of empathy for white supremacists or something like that.
Yeah. No one had any empathy for the white supremacists, or take it even down a notch. When they said we need to have empathy for the hurting and broken, did they mean the coal miner in the red hat? Was he the object? Was you should so and if so, then what would that look like? Well, if we just kept the parallel in terms of the way it worked the other way, it means you need to listen to him, understand his concerns, and seek to validate them according to the gospel. The gospel, you need to show how the gospel is the answer to his concern. So he's lost his job because of illegal immigration, taking all the jobs, and therefore you should rearrange your politics in order to serve his community. How many people did that? How many people were like, well, that's empathy means? And it's like nobody did. Very few people thought that compassion for him. Instead, it was he was the scapegoat in compassion for the others. So it becomes left coded, and therefore even conservative evangelicals kind of absorb that by osmosis and want to demonstrate that we care too. Now, oftentimes there was a little bit of a leash, right? We still want to be biblical, but that meant we had to kind of fudge, and it's how the left was able to steer and manipulate churches into going along with sort of like milder forms of the rebellion that was going on in the culture. So the world did the Me Too thing, which there were real evils there. It's often, this is the point, it's often a response to real evils. But then the answer was believe all women. Some women have been abused, and therefore any woman who claims to be abused, you need to believe her and affirm and validate what she says. And so churches adopted that mindset. And as a result, women discovered in certain cases that exaggerating or reframing themselves as victims. So normal marital conflict, for example, gets reframed as abuse. So, 40 years ago, what's happening here is a problem. There's sin, but it's sin here. Reframing it as, no, this is abuse. This is emotional abuse or psychological abuse. That word in particular was expanded. So language inflation kicks in. And so you begin to define more and more behaviors as abusive because it's a very potent word. And then once you've framed it as there's an abuser and an abused, there's an oppressor and a victim. Well, now the victim's in the driver's seat, and all efforts need to be made to punish him and to validate and affirm her. And so that was a really, and now all of a sudden it's not about if you say, and if you're the person in the room, if you're the elder in that room, and you say, well, wait a minute, did it actually happen the way that she said? That's not what he said happened. And that's not what the neighbors thought happened. That's, like if you start to actually ask the questions and just resist, well, now you're re-victimizing, you're re-traumatizing, you're harming them because you're not validating and affirming them. And you're going, well, wait a minute, I just want to know before I know where my emotions should go, I need to know what's true. Like my emotions need to be tracking with the truth and not simply be tracking with whoever came into my office first. And so there were things like that I think would be good examples of where the church, well-intentioned people who wanted to care well for the hurting, got hijacked. And as a result, you ended up with all kinds of exaggerations and overwrought things, or things that were presented as this is a problem in one place is universalized everywhere, has this. Statistics get you leverage there. I think the racial conversation was another one where certain events became kind of totems, icons for narratives of oppression. The whole microaggression thing that happened where, you might say something and inadvertently harm, re-traumatize someone, a minority, that sort of thing. Or, we want to pursue racial harmony, but certain people can speak and certain people can't. And if you try to say, well, wait a minute, I don't know that this is a good idea, I don't think this is going to help. White guy, shut up, check your privilege. that sort of, all of those are examples of what I, now affectionately call the victimhood Olympics, where the greatest victim found themselves in the driver's seat and they set the agenda for the entire community. And so there was a competition culturally out in the culture, and then it worked its way into the church, to be the greatest victim, because they knew that soft-hearted people and respectable people would want to be seen to be compassionate. And so if that's what it means to be compassionate, we'll go along with it.
All right. Well, let's then now take it a little closer to even people into their home lives, their family lives. How does this play out there?
Yeah. So I think you mentioned a couple at the outset, a failure to discipline because you don't want to upset your kid. The sort of if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy philosophy of husband, wife, happy life. There's a male version of this where a woman can have a husband who's very emotional, can fly off the handle, and she's always trying to like placate him, and he can learn. So it's interesting. People think they think they see the title and they assume, well, you're not going to be able to care well for victims. Part of my response, there's a section in the book that talks about the way that abusers are very adept at manipulating the empathy of both their victims and the surrounding community. So someone does something evil and they tell the victim, don't tell anybody, I'll get in so much trouble. Okay. What's he doing? He's appealing to his victim's empathy and saying, lie on my behalf, because if you don't, then bad things will happen to me. And you don't want bad things to happen to me. You don't want me to get in trouble, do you? And then they can do the same thing to pastors, right? So someone actually does something evil and it's like, please cover this up. Don't let anybody know, And so and if the pastor goes along with that and says, okay, well, just this one time and don't you do it again. And abusers are very adept at manipulating and doing stuff like that. So again, that's back in the culture. But the point is that you can have, while on the one hand, there is a chapter in the book and we could talk about feminism and the way that it feeds into some of this. But in principle, anybody can be the manipulator, but I'm not mainly concerned with the sin of manipulation. I didn't call the book the sin of manipulation. I called the book Sin of Empathy, because the actual place that you need to shore up is your capacity to tolerate other people's emotional distress, right? You need to have a higher threshold for emotional pain in other people and not allow their pain to so agitate you that it sort of short circuits wisdom, justice, so that you don't think straight. And so in any given family, it could be anybody. It could be a husband who blows up or shuts down. It could be a wife who falls into tears or whose anger sets the emotional tone. It could be the kids running roughshod, figuring out that, the parents work that way. So this is the way to how do you get your way in this house? Throw the biggest fit. Okay. In all of those cases, you're going to have what's enabling it. The point is, what's enabling this whole gnarly system is untethered empathy. And what's needed is a greater degree of sober-mindedness, a backbone, to be stable, to know what's good and true, and then to move that way deliberately, regardless, right, of people's emotional outbursts. But you're saying, no, we're going to do what's good and right. We're going to do what God says. And then our emotions need to follow along and get in line.
Yeah, I just preached this last week from 2 Samuel 6, and David first brings the ark, the big failure there, but then he brings the ark into Jerusalem, and he's dancing with all his might, and he's wearing the linen ephod, and his wife comes out, and you've really done it this time. You've really distinguished yourself, and you're dressed like one of those. I love the Living Bible. It's a paraphrase, but I think it gets it pretty good. It says you're dressed like a pervert in front of everybody. She's just really laying it on thick. And it's like, and David he does not fall into empathy about that. He's not manipulated by any of that. And he stands firm. And so we talk about maintaining frame at my church. And I think that's what you're talking about. Really just
great.
So how do you maintain frame in the face of this? Because this is what you're talking about, really, for my generation, I think younger, maybe even older, has been just the air we breathe. I mean, how do you escape this and actually be able to maintain frame and not be blown off course by other people's emotions?
Yeah. So the biblical virtue, and this is, you mentioned Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, which was the book. They're kind of companions. Sin of Empathy dives deeper on one of the elements in the sabotage toolkit. But sober-mindedness is the virtue that I commend, which I think maintaining frame, which I've heard different groups use that kind of idea, and it's a really good one. Has to do with sober-mindedness. You're not drunk on other people's passions, because that's the opposite of being sober, is to be drunk. Drunk on what? Drunk on people's emotions, your emotions or other people's emotions. And sober-mindedness, so cultivating that virtue, clarity of mind. So you know who you are, you know who God is, you fear the Lord, and you know what the body's for. What's this entity that I'm the head of for? And because of that, I have clarity about direction. I wake up in the morning knowing who I am, what I'm about, and then I'm going to use God's means to get us there. So that's clarity of mind, and then a stability of soul. So there's some gravity, there's some substance. That's again fear of the Lord. I fear God more than I fear man, and man's emotions or agitation. And then a readiness to act. So you're not passive, you're not abdicating. Instead, you're saying, this is my responsibility and I need to do something about it. So clarity of mind, stability of soul, readiness to act, cultivating those, practicing those, asking for God's help, and becoming a sober-minded person. That's the antidote to all of the emotional folly that surrounds us. But it is interesting the way that people's agitation activate our own agitation. So someone is upset. So the David and Michal example you gave, where her displeasure is the sort of thing that you could imagine if you didn't have it in the Bible, but you just describe that scenario. A husband does something like this, and his wife comes and is very upset and says, you've been very undignified, and you've been, look, what are the neighbors going to think? You could imagine a Christian pastor saying, hey, brother, I know you don't think you did anything wrong, but you need to be a servant leader, right? And you need to listen to your wife, and you need to love her and live with her in an understanding way. And all of those verses could easily be twisted in order to get him to accommodate to her agitation, because men tend to find female agitation and displeasure intolerable. It's hard. And so that's a snare, right? In a marriage, is for good men in particular, it is, how do I live with my wife in an understanding way? That is a biblical command. I need to take into account, what is she seeing and what does she need? So I'm living with her according to knowledge. I need to show honor in all of it, but I can't outsource my responsibility. I can't hand the keys over to her and say, well, you be the head then, honey. You lead the way. That's an abdication of my responsibility. And so growing in the ability to absorb some of that emotion, and then being able to go, okay, I need to take that into account, but now I need to see clearly what is actually the right thing to do. What's the wise thing to do? How can I, use her wisdom, which she may have plenty of good insight. She's seeing things in the kids that are really there, and you need to go, I need to take that into account. But I can't but whose responsibility is it? And it's not going to help if you simply outsource that responsibility to her. She's not going to respect it, and it's probably going to go badly over time.
I think just a real physical thing you can even do in those kind of circumstances is you don't have to respond right away. You can pause for just a second. I can't remember who I was watching an interview of, and he was talking about just take a breath and then think. And that just, it helps ground you a little bit and keeps you from, because especially with your wife, I mean, the tears come and you're ready to move heaven and hell to try to stop that.
Yeah.
And you have to find a way to disconnect and break and stay steady. Because again, it goes back to what we said. You're actually not really loving when you just give into that, and you are diving in. The response is not coming from love. It's coming from, I gotta stop this. It's messing me up. It's messing my feelings up. I don't like how this is. And it's really, your action will be simply it'll be selfish. Self-protection.
Yeah. Right.
So any other real practical steps that you have for men in particular regarding this?
It's good. It's at least worth to remember as a kind of abuse does not abolish use. So the fact that the world has weaponized compassion in order to steer us doesn't mean we should swing to the other pendulum and say, well, no compassion. So the last chapter in the book is called In Praise of Compassion. And I use a couple of different examples, including Christ at Lazarus's tomb, weeping with Mary and Martha in their grief, joining them in their suffering. But still, he didn't remove all the suffering, right? He waited so that Lazarus would die, and therefore caused them some pain, some substantial pain, and then joined them in the pain that he caused, right? And then raised Lazarus from the dead. And so there's something there for us to learn from. But we don't want to become calloused and hard-hearted simply because, the left or the world has decided they can steer us by our compassion. It'd be easy to swing to the other. Instead, we need to cultivate tethered compassion that's anchored to something. You mentioned earlier that, the fear of man. One of the little riffs I do to try to make this plain, because in connecting empathy, pity, compassion to other passions, is when James says the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. Okay. It's like, well, neither does the fear of man, neither does the empathy of man. Okay. The compassion of man, the pity of man does not work the righteousness of God. But what about the anger of God? Does that work the righteousness of God? Yeah, that does. And so does the fear of God, and so does the compassion of God. So the idea there is who's defining and determining what those words mean and calibrating those emotional states. And it's like, is it man or God? If God's the one, if you're conforming your emotions to what God says, loving what he loves, hating what he hates, then that's good. Then your emotions are channeled in the right direction because they're guided by your reason. They're not out of control, and you're submitted to God. And so in that sense, husbands and fathers need to cultivate right emotional responses, which is different than saying no emotion. Well, we're not going to have any emotion around here because of empathy. No. You need to have rightly ordered emotions, rightly ordered affections that are defined and channeled according to what God says.
Well, Dr. Rigney, I have really enjoyed our conversation. I know you have some other engagements to get to, and so I appreciate the time that you gave me here early this morning. And I think this will be really helpful for the men listening, that we want to stay right where God's got it, right on the narrow path of following his commands, not falling into a hard-heartedness and a lack of compassion and love, while also not falling into this selfish empathy. And I think you helped us steer us rightly here. So thank you for coming on today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, God bless you. But when David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids, as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me above your father, above all his house, to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I will celebrate before the Lord. I will be more lightly esteemed than this, and will be humble in my own eyes. But with the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be distinguished." Brothers, David knew who he was. When he brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, he wasn't thinking about pleasing people. It wasn't trying to win political points. He wasn't even worried about how he looked in the eyes of his wife, Michal. Michal despised him. She mocked him. She accused him of humiliating herself before the people. But David didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't lose his frame. He stood firm because he knew who he was, a servant of the living God. He knew what he was called to do, to honor God with all his might. And he doubled down on obedience, not because it was easy, because it was right. And Scripture tells us God blessed him. David put God first, and that made all the difference. So, brothers, let me challenge you. Dig down deep in what Jesus has done for you. Hang on tight to what he has said about who you are. Cling firmly to the mission that he's given you. And when you do all of that, you'll be able to stand. So, if you found today's episode helpful, I want to challenge you. Like it, share it, subscribe to the podcast, send it to a man you know who needs to hear the truth. I'm hoping to build an army of men who are strong for Christ, men who will stand when the world bows, men who will fight when others flee, men who will lead when others collapse. So, until next time, build, fight, protect, and lead. This is the Patriarchy.